Hi all, welcome back. Today we're going to talk about biological themes that connect all of biology. Okay? We're going to talk about some issues, some theories, and we're going to look at, the backbone or the base level of biology. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. So first off, remember that we just talked about biology and what biology is, and that's the study of life. Okay, well, the study of life has these organizing themes, okay? And there are 5 of these themes. And no matter what we're talking about in biology, almost everything we talk about will have connections to at least one, if not all, of these biological themes. Okay. The first theme that most of you probably guessed based on the opening picture is evolution. Okay. Now, so remember, if biology is the study of life, and evolution is things changing over time, okay, then evolution has to be the backbone to biology, or at least one of the backbones to biology. So evolution is itself, the definition is genetic change in a species over time. Okay? And in actuality, it's probably not even to the species level. So it might just be, a better definition would be genetic change in a population over time. Okay? So the whole species doesn't have to change, but you can have these little pockets of population. So maybe let's talk about something like a frog. Okay? And let's say we build a road between 2 ponds. Okay? And the frogs can no longer cross that road. Okay? It's not really habitable for them to make that venture. So those ponds become isolated, okay? And those frog populations become isolated, and maybe they were the same species. Maybe they're Pseudacrius pippins, which is the leopard frog. Okay, so they're the same species, but over a long period of time, because there's no mixing of genetic material, these populations have the chance to change. Okay, and genetics can change drastically in one direction or the other, or it can be stable for many years, okay, and then all of a sudden, temperature changes, or a predator gets introduced, or a new plant comes in, a new insect comes in, okay? Lots of different things can occur, and the individuals that are best suited for the environment, they'll be able to pass their genes on to the next generation. That's where the genetic change comes in. It's not genetic change within an individual. It's a genetic change within the population. Okay? Now, often we talk about evolution, and probably the first person to come to mind is Charles Darwin. Okay? And a lot of people think that Charles Darwin invented evolution. Okay? But no one invents biological themes. No one invents how nature works. They discover it. Okay? And even at that, Charles Darwin didn't discover evolution. He didn't even coin the term evolution. I mean, his grandfather used the term evolution way before him. Okay? What Charles Darwin did, and I'm not discrediting Charles Darwin, he's a great scientist and did excellent work, but what he did is he discovered a mechanism for how evolution could occur. Okay? So up to the point of Charles Darwin's theory of natural selection, most scientists, most people on the planet that had scientific backgrounds, whether they're a geologist or ecologist or whatever, even physiologist, they knew species change. They saw it with their own eyes, that species could change. Okay? But there was no mechanism for that change, okay, put forth until Charles Darwin put forth natural selection. He also put forth a couple others: sexual selection and artificial selection. Okay? And we'll talk about other ways at which evolution can occur that Charles Darwin had no clue about. Okay? And we'll get to that when we start talking more about evolution later on in the course. Okay? Now, when we look at the 1.5 million species that have been described to date, okay, we now know, because there's so many connecting points and things like that, that evolution is explaining this diversity. Okay? When we look and see that there's roughly 350,000 different types of beetles, okay, we're really concentrating on, well, what changed? Are they changing because of habitat? Are they changing because of food requirements? Are they changing because temperature requirements? Color form? What's changing? Do they communicate with each other? What's going on? Okay? And that's explained by evolution. Okay? Small changes is enough to drive big things. If you're interested more in evolution, which I find is an extremely important topic, I am an evolutionary ecologist, so therefore, I talk about evolution a lot. But if you want to learn more about aspects of evolution, I highly suggest one, or if not all three, of these books. Again, The Origin of Species by Charles Darwin. Okay, that was the book that he wrote a long time ago, and in the 1800s, mid 1800s. And in my opinion purely, okay, if you're starting off in Gen Bio and you're going into a biology career, I just suggest you read this book sometime, but maybe not now. Okay, The Origin of Species by Charles Darwin is super boring. It is a boring book, okay? And realize, it was written in the 1800s, so DNA and genetics and none of that information is there, okay? Yet, it didn't matter, because Charles Darwin knew that species changed based on the information that he gathered, okay? And so, it's an interesting read after you learn about what we know today, because then you can go back and say, wow, Charles Darwin knew that, almost 200 years ago. Okay, he knew about that piece of information. Okay, Bill Nye is an excellent writer, science writer. He wrote Undeniable. This is a new book. I think it came out in 2015, maybe 2016. Okay, excellent book. Really easy to go through, read the material. Okay, not super technical or anything like that. Just a very good, well-written book. Okay, and then my favorite by far is Your Inner Fish. Okay, and this is a book about the human body and our connection back to fish ancestors. So, talking about bone connections, ear connections, vocals, all kinds of things. Neil Shubin wrote this book. He's the one who found Tiktaalik, which is this transition species between fish and amphibians. I highly suggest these books. Again, I'll put the links underneath. But if you're interested in evolution, definitely check them out. All right, second biological theme is the flow of energy. Okay, we'll talk a lot about the flow of energy. Okay, how energy is captured by autotrophs, and then what do heterotrophs, or things that eat autotrophs, do with that energy. Okay, so we know that all things require energy, all living things require energy, and how they get that energy differs. Okay, some are autotrophs and they capture energy from outside sources and then utilize special structures like chloroplasts and special proteins and pigments to develop or to combine different types of chemicals into stored energy. And then there's the heterotrophs, which are consuming that energy, and what do they do with it? They break down those big chemical bonds and utilize that energy. We'll look at this in a great detail when we talk about photosynthesis and cellular respiration. Okay? Most of the energy comes from sun. Okay? Again, we'll talk a little bit about chemosynthesis, okay, or chemical synthesizing energy, but for the most part, when we talk about energy, we're going to be talking about sun energy, or energy that's coming from photons of light. Okay? And then I just mentioned this, organisms acquire energy differently, okay, and we'll approach that later. Okay? Now, one of the key parts when it comes to the flow of energy, and we'll get to this when we start talking about ecology, is energy often dictates hierarchy, or what organisms, or what the size of the population of organisms on the top can be. So I often bring in examples, for people that are familiar with Wyoming. Okay, I often bring in examples like wolf population. Okay, and people often think, well, man, if you have a hunting season on wolves, you must have thousands of wolves, because we have thousands of elk and hundreds of thousands of antelope, and thousands, hundreds of thousands of deer. Okay, but in actuality, we only have a couple hundred wolves in the state of Wyoming at any time. Okay, and they're top predators, though, so it's very different. Their population can't really get that large, because they're constrained by how many organisms are underneath them to feed on. So normally when we look at like an energy pyramid or a food web, the top predators, they're normally not very species rich, or not, the population's not very high, because of the constraints below. As you move up the level of the pyramid, the amount of energy needed to raise young, hunt, thermoregulate, etc., increases. Okay, and so when we talk about wolf populations in Wyoming, you got a couple hundred wolves, and you might have 100,000 elk, okay, which is the main food source of wolves. Okay? And we'll come back to this. And so what the energy flow is, so how's it flowing, okay, can really determine what organisms are found in an ecosystem, and how many of that organism is found in that ecosystem. Okay, cooperation is another one that we'll talk about, okay, and it really comes about and coincides with all organisms need energy, okay, and that is, energy is limited, okay, in most situations, okay, maybe not in the United States or developed countries is energy limited to a point. Most of us can just walk out and get a meal, okay, even if you don't have very much money, you can still get 2,000 calories in a day. There are lots of people that have no money and can get 2,000 calories in a day. Therefore, energy in those situations are not limited. But for most organisms on the planet, okay, energy is limited, or resources in general are limited. And so that means that sometimes to get energy, you need to cooperate with another organism, okay, with another species, okay? And there's lots of ways at which cooperation works, okay? And some of them drive what we call symbiosis, or a relationship where one species and another species come in direct contact, and they both might benefit from that contact, or maybe one is not harmed by that contact and the other one benefits, okay? For example, if you look at this, okay, so if you look at this organism up here, okay, that's a termite, okay? If you look at this piece right here, that's the inside of a termite, okay, so the intestinal tract, here's the stomach, okay? And then if you look at this right here, this is a symbiotic bacteria that lives inside the stomach of termites. Okay? If you remove this, so let's say we gave this termite antibiotics that killed this, what would happen to this termite is they would starve to death. Okay? They cannot digest wood without this symbiotic bacteria. Okay? But you cannot take this bacteria out and grow it outside of the termite. So this symbiotic relationship, both organisms need each other. Okay? They have to have each other. Okay? The termite itself can't live without the bacteria. Okay? And the bacteria really can't live out without the ecosystem in which the termite's gut provides. So you might ask, well, how does a baby termite get this bacteria? Is the bacteria in the genome of the termite? And that's not the case. Okay? This is an individual species that's living inside. Okay? And the way it's done is termites, the mother termite, will chew up food and regurgitate it into the baby termites. With that goes some beneficial bacteria. And then the youngsters can then consume wood products. Okay? And so pretty interesting symbiotic relationship going on with termites. Okay? Another biological theme is structure determines function. When we start talking about evolution, but we'll also see this throughout the entire semester. Okay? We'll talk about a feature, maybe an organelle, or maybe an outside protein coating, something, and we'll talk about the structure of it. What does it look like? An enzyme having an activation site. Okay, that structure will determine its function. Okay, you alter the structure, you change the function. Sometimes by altering the structure, it has no function anymore. Okay, like denaturing a protein. Okay, but overall, when we talk about evolution, okay, evolution favors structures that have an adaptive manner. Okay, and so most of the time, what we're talking about are features that would give a individual, okay, a leg up on competition, or an ability to survive a habitat better than another organism, whether that be coat color, whether that be the pads of their feet, the ability to fly, glide, the ability to eat ants, whatever it might be. Okay, so there's all kinds of features and structures out there, and when they come about, okay, if they don't give an individual an adaptive advantage, okay, then you would expect that feature goes away, or that feature is not harmful and doesn't cause the individual any detriment to that individual's life. So sorry about that. So anyways, when we talk about evolution and features and things like that, okay, if a feature is not detrimental to the organism, they will often become reduced. Okay? So you might not lose it all completely, but it becomes reduced. So if you, for example, let's talk about like whales or dolphins or something like that. Now, so all those organisms, all those marine mammals started from an organism that was on the land, okay, and that migrated into the water, and eventually having limbs is a disadvantage. You can't swim nearly as well if you have limbs. Okay? And so if you did a dissection, or if you just did an X-ray of a whale or a dolphin or something like that, you'll see a pelvic girdle. You'll see the bone, okay, where the pelvis should be and where the legs would attach inside these organisms. Okay? So snakes are the same way. Okay? They have a pelvic girdle, okay, where legs once attached. Okay? But there's no legs there. Now that girdle's not getting in the way, that girdle does nothing, so it hasn't completely disappeared. Okay, so again, these are what we call vestigial characteristics. They're left over from an adaptive characteristic at one time, or the loss of an adaptive characteristic at one time. So becoming more adapted to an environment. We'll approach these when we get to evolution more. Okay? And so again, structures determine functions, and then those structures become more specialized. Okay, and so we'll look at things like, a butterfly's proboscis, and the fact that if a butterfly or a moth or really any insect's feeding on nectar, and they feed on one specific flower, often their proboscis will be as long as the nectar tube on that flower. Okay, and so they've adapted to only feed on a specific flower, and their tongue is just long enough to feed on that, or their proboscis is just long enough to feed on that flower. Okay. The other thing that we'll talk about is convergent evolution. So maybe things that are not related to each other, but they converge on the same kind of structure. Okay. So if you look at something like an organism that can fly, okay, so you take birds and bats and butterflies and dragonflies, and you take all these organisms and you look, they all have wings. Now, how the wing is constructed and how it develops is different, but every one of them has wings. Okay? And whether that be like finger wings, which bats have, or a wrist wing, which is what a bird has, or filled cells, okay, or filled tubes, which is what dragonflies and butterflies have. Okay, it's still a wing, okay? And that's convergent evolution. Those organisms are not related to each other in the sense that along the evolutionary trend, okay, those organisms evolved from things that didn't have wings. Okay, and so they developed wings separately, but when we look now today, they all have wings. So things that fly have wings. That's convergent evolution. We'll come back to it also. And the fifth one is homeostasis. Okay, homeostasis is confusing for some people because we often think about homeostasis from just a human aspect. Okay, so homeostasis is a physiological condition of steady state. Okay, and when we say steady state, it often gives this, this idea of it has to be completely stable at maybe one number. Okay? So, like for example, our body temperature being 98.6 degrees, that's homeostasis. If we deviate much above that or much below that, okay, we become very ill, but your proteins start breaking down, these kind of things, you become sick, and then you eventually die, either direction. Okay? But homeostasis is steady state, and it's determined by the organism's, if we're talking about temperature, by the organism's thermal range. So for example, if we were talking about a snake, and so if I had a snake in this room, it's about 70 degrees, the body temperature of the snake is 70 degrees Fahrenheit. If I went over to the thermostat and turned it up to 80, it would be 80. If I turned it down to 50, it would be 50. Now, their thermal range is very different than our thermal range, but they still are in a steady state. They're still experiencing homeostasis. Okay? So organisms can fluctuate, and it depends on what organism we're talking about. So there's some organisms like devil's hole pupfish or different types of desert fish that they can be in completely fresh water one day, and then 30 days later, no rains, no runoff, nothing like that. Okay, and those pools of water are starting to dry up, and they could be 30 times salt water. So salinity is, way up, and they're still completely fine. They're still experiencing homeostasis. It's just their range is very different. Okay, and I bring that up because we'll start talking about homeostasis, or we'll start talking about physiological conditions when we talk about cellular respiration and cells and things like that, and just realize we can't approach everything from a human aspect. Okay, we have to approach it like other organisms have other capabilities, and their steady state is different than our steady state. Okay, but nonetheless, when we look at internal environments, okay, most organisms have correction system in their internal environment, which makes it stable or in that steady state. For example, as the time of day goes on, let's say you ate in the morning and drank some orange juice or water or milk or whatever, okay, and let's say you don't eat or drink for 5 hours. Okay? As time goes on, you'll become thirsty. Okay? Probably thirsty more than hungry at first. Okay? And that thirst, that is a control system in your body that's telling your body, look, you have too many salts and not enough water. Okay? And so you need to balance that. You need to come back to the stable state. So you become thirsty and you would seek out water. If you went further and you went into dehydration, okay, then your body starts stealing stuff. Okay, so your body will start stealing water from cells, external cells first, okay, and your skin will start drying out, your lips will dry out, okay, this kind of stuff, and they'll move it into the region where your organs are, okay, to try to keep them as healthy as possible and working, okay. And then if you go even further into, into a phase where, you might be 10 or 15% dehydrated, okay, now you start to get headaches, okay, your eyes will start to become blurry and things like that, and that's because water is being pulled out of those regions, okay, and you're really trying to maintain a stable state, okay. And so lots of organisms have these control mechanisms, and we'll talk about some as we move. Okay? And there's other things that organisms can do, and they can do it both innate. So innate is what we call genetically controlled behaviors or genetically controlled aspects, and then learned behaviors. For example, let's say you go outside and it's cold, okay, maybe 10 degrees, something like that, and you're in shorts and a t-shirt. Probably the first thing that you're going to do is cross your arms, okay? And most of you won't even know that you did this, okay? The next thing that you might do is you might hunch over, okay? Try to make yourself smaller, conserve heat, okay? And then you'll start shivering. Shivering is an innate, okay, response to cold. You're trying to fire your muscles to heat them up. Lots of organisms do this, okay? When bees overnight on a plant and it gets cold, okay, you might approach that plant and you'll see that bee and it's just sitting there. It's doing nothing in the morning, okay? But if you watch that bee very carefully, it's firing its back muscles really fast, okay? So it's shivering, and that shivering is heating up its internal body, and it's heating up its entire body in some aspects, but it's definitely heating up its flight muscles, so eventually it has enough warmth, okay, that it can fly away from that plant. And it's just a shivering mechanism, just like we have a shivering mechanism, okay, and that is to try to control and create more heat by firing your muscles. Okay, so with that, those are the 5 biological themes. Okay? We're going to move from biological themes into how do scientists do science. Okay, so the scientific method, okay, hypothesis testing, okay, what is a good experimental design, these kind of things. And then we'll move into chemistry of life. So what are the chemicals that all organisms are made of? Okay? All right, so see you next time.